I want you to imagine just for a second a nation that has just immense human capital.
Right.
We're talking about a highly educated, really tech-savvy population, just vast natural resources, and a location that is so strategic, it literally bridges global continents.
Yeah, it's a massive geographic advantage.
Exactly. I mean, by all conventional metrics, this country has literally every single ingredient required to be an absolute economic powerhouse. But instead, it's locked in this compounding structural crisis.
Yeah.
It's grappling with hyperinflation, massive currency depreciation, and really deep systemic social unrest.
It's a profound paradox, honestly, because you look at the raw inputs, right, and the output, it just doesn't make sense. Yeah. Not until you actually lift the hood and examine the underlying machinery of the political economy. The dysfunction, it isn't an accident. It is built directly into the architecture of the state itself.
And the nation we're unpacking today is Iran. But, we're not just doing a postmortem on the current crisis.
No, not at all.
Right, the mission to today's deep dive is to actually look forward. We're going to explore the global lessons for economic recovery and democratic consolidation in Iran. How does a country actually untangle decades of deeply intertwined political and economic dysfunction?
It's a huge question.
It really is. So to figure that out, we are looking at a highly charged stack of global economic data. We've got World Bank modeling, International Finance Corporation data on foreign direct investment, and historical transition blueprints.
Yeah, from places like Poland, Spain, South Africa, and Argentina.
Exactly.
And just to set the parameters right at the top here for you listening, because we are digging into models that involve, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
The IRGC.
Right, the IRGC, or proposed transitional figures like Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, or even contentious economic strategies like Javier Milei's administration in Argentina. We are operating with strict neutrality today. Our goal isn't to endorse any political faction or figure. I mean, we are simply here to unpack the math, the historical precedents, and the economic mechanisms. We just want to look at how nations attempt to pull themselves out of this kind of institutional spiral.
Right. We are strictly here for the mechanics.
Yeah.
So let's just start by diagnosing the actual disease here. Because if you tune into mainstream coverage, the narrative often boils down to basically a single variable, which is Western sanctions.
Yeah, that's the common assumption.
Right. People assume that if you just remove the sanctions, the Iranian economy automatically repairs itself. But the macroeconomic analyses we're looking at, they completely reject that premise.
They do, because treating sanctions as a purely exogenous shock, like a sudden hurricane hitting an otherwise perfectly structurally sound house,
right,
that's a fundamental misdiagnosis. I mean, the crisis in Iran is overwhelmingly structural. It is rooted in a political economy that institutionalized what the forces call a dual structure of governance.
The dual structure.
Yeah. So on paper, you have formal elected institutions. There's a parliament, a president, a cabinet. But in reality, you have these informal, unelected power centers, and they hold the actual leverage, and crucially, they control the capital.
Okay, let's unpack this. Wait. I always thought Iran was described as a classic rentier state.
A lot of people do.
Right, because the standard definition of that is just a centralized government that floats on endless oil revenue. Right. And they take that money and just buy complacency from the public.
Exactly, yeah.
But if they have all the oil wealth centralized at the very top, why on earth would they need a dual structure?
It's a really great question, and it highlights a major shift in how political scientists actually understand the country today. Sociologist Kevin Harris points out that Iran evolved past that simple rentier state model years ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He describes the current system as a subcontractor state. So instead of the central government just managing everything directly, it deliberately diffused its authority. It pushed its wealth through this network of loyal, semi-public institutions. Basically, it outsourced its monopoly.
Oh, to bypass the sanctions.
Exactly.
Nah.
I mean, when your formal banking sector is totally cut off from the global financial system, the central government struggles to operate normally. So it relies on these shadowy parastatal networks.
Because they can operate in the dark.
Right. They are highly adept at operating in a gray market smuggling-based economy. And the ultimate beneficiaries of this whole system are the bonyads.
The bonyads. The religious foundation.
Yeah.
Because these originally started in the aftermath of the 1979 revolution, right?
We did.
The stated goal, I think, was to confiscate the massive wealth and assets of the fleeing elite and redistribute it to the poor and, like, the families of war veterans.
Yeah, that was the ideological justification.
Yeah.
But the mechanism of how they operate today is entirely different. Over the decades, these foundations basically morphed into colossal tax-exempt conglomerates. I mean, they own everything. Construction companies, banks, manufacturing plants, shipping fleets, and their power just absolutely exploded during the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in 2000s.
Through that process, the data refers to as pseudo-privatization, right?
Precisely.
Which basically means they took state-owned enterprises and pretended to sell them off to the private sector, but they really just handed them straight to insiders.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the government had massive debts, right? And to clear them off the balance sheet, they transferred ownership of major state assets directly to the IRGC and these boneyards.
So no public bidding.
No, it wasn't an open auction. It wasn't listed on a public exchange where everyday citizens could buy shares. It was just an internal transfer of wealth. The analytical term for this in the sources is quantitative socialism.
Quantitative socialism, that's a wild term. That implies the state is controlling the economy, but, like, not in a Marxist worker collective kind of way.
Right, not at all.
It's a monopoly designed to serve a very specific clerical and military elite.
Yes. The state maintains this top-down control to fund its ideological apparatus. So, returning to your earlier point about sanctions,
Right.
isolating Iran from global markets didn't create this subcontractor system, but it drastically accelerated it. It killed off the genuine, independent private sector.
Because they couldn't survive the inflation.
Exactly. Small businesses couldn't survive the inflation and the total lack of credit. The only entities left standing were the Bonyans and the IRGC because they had the state's backing and the smuggling routes.
So if a new democratic government theoretically comes into power, they aren't just inheriting a bad economy.
No, it's much worse.
They are inheriting an economy where the military and unelected clerics physically own a massive percentage of the country's GDP.
Yeah.
That requires a very specific kind of systemic dismantling. Which I guess brings us to the transition blueprints.
Right.
Because if you look at history, you generally have two ways out of this kind of authoritarian entanglement, right?
Yeah.
You either negotiate with the old guard or you just rip the whole system down.
Those are basically the two ends of the spectrum. The first model is the pacted transition.
Okay.
The classic examples here are Spain in the late 1970s, after the death of Francisco Franco, or South Africa's transition in the 1990s. In a pacted transition, the incoming democratic forces sit down and negotiate with the outgoing regime.
They make compromises.
Exactly. You guarantee that certain regime elites won't be prosecuted or, that they get to keep some of their assets in exchange for them stepping down peacefully. The whole goal is to minimize violence and prevent a total collapse of state services.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like a corporate merger where the old corrupt executives agree to step down, but only if they get to keep their lucrative board seats and, like, a golden parachute.
That is an incredibly accurate way to look at it. And actually, that exact compromise is why the macroeconomic blueprints strongly advise against a pacted transition for Iran.
Because if the IRGC keeps its board seats, so to speak, you haven't actually fixed the structural problem. You've just given it a new title.
What's fascinating here is that democratic consolidation relies on reaching what political scientists call a procedural minimum.
Procedural minimum.
Yeah. This means you cannot have tutelary powers, meaning unelected bodies that hold veto power over elected officials.
Right, right.
If you have an elected parliament, but an unelected military council can just veto their budgets or rewrite their laws, you don't actually have a democracy. You have a hostage situation with ballot boxes.
Wow, yeah.
And the pacted transition in Iran would almost certainly leave the military boneyard complex perfectly intact, meaning that procedural minimum for democracy would never be met.
Which leaves the second blueprint, which is rapid reform, or better known as shock therapy.
Yes.
This is like the Bolshevik plan in Poland in the early 90s, or what we are currently seeing with Javier Milei in Argentina. Mechanically, this isn't about compromise at all. This is a hostile takeover where you immediately clear out the entire C-suite. You rapidly liberalize prices, you slash state subsidies overnight, and you just ruthlessly break up the state monopolies to establish civilian control. It's like treating a severe systemic infection.
Right.
Do you negotiate with the infection like a pacted transition to avoid shocking the body? Or do you use shock therapy to just amputate the disease part, knowing it's going to hurt like hell initially?
And historically, that does inflict severe short-term social pain. I mean, when Poland applied shock therapy to transition away from a Soviet-style planned economy, prices skyrocketed.
Yeah, the inflation was crazy.
Right, and inefficient state-run industries just collapsed overnight. It led to massive unemployment. But structurally, it definitively broke the power of the old monopolies.
But applying that kind of blunt force shock therapy to Iran presents a very specific problem. Because you can't just flip a switch, dissolve the boneyards, and fire everyone who works for them.
No, you absolutely cannot. And the historical analyses explicitly warn against outright abolition.
Wait, what? If they are the root of the subcontractor state, why wouldn't a new government just, legally dissolve them on day one?
Because over the last 40 years, the boneyards have intentionally embedded themselves deep into the social fabric of the country.
Oh, right.
They aren't just military holding companies. They operate thousands of hospitals, massive agricultural cooperatives, and localized welfare programs. If you legally dissolve them overnight, the immediate collapse of the social safety net would be catastrophic.
That people would starve.
Exactly. The new democracy would lose public support in a matter of weeks.
So you're effectively trying to defuse a bomb that is wired directly into the country's life support system.
That's a great way to put it.
If you cut the wrong wire, the military regains power. If you just rip the bomb out, the patient dies.
Yeah.
So what is the surgical tool to separate the two?
The proposed mechanism here is termed outsider privatization.
Outsider privatization.
Yeah. Yeah, so instead of abolishing the foundations, you force them into the light of the formal competitive economy. Step 1, you subject all boneyard assets to rigorous, independent international audits.
Okay.
Step 2, you strip away their special tax exemptions and preferential exchange rates. You force them to compete on a totally level playing field.
Makes sense.
Step 3, you transition them into publicly traded corporations and list them on the Tehran Stock Exchange. And crucially, all of this economic demilitarization has to be legally anchored by constitutional referendum.
To make it permanent.
Right, a referendum that definitively strips sovereignty from the clerical guardianship and places it solely in the hands of an elected parliament.
Okay, I follow the logic of forcing them to become normal companies.
Yeah.
But practically, I see a glaring flaw here.
What's that?
Well, if the IRGC and the boneyards currently control up to half the country's GDP,
Yeah.
right, and you try outsider privatization and list their shares on the stock exchange, who on earth actually has the capital to buy those shares?
Yeah.
I mean, the Iranian middle class has been decimated by inflation. If the only people with cash are the regime insiders, aren't you just allowing the old elites to legally buy back their own monopolies? You'd just be creating a brand new class of corrupt, post-Soviet-style oligarchs.
You've just identified the exact vulnerability of outsider privatization.
Oh, really?
Yes. The transition models highly emphasize that domestic capital alone is insufficient. It's dangerous for exactly the reason you just mentioned.
Right.
To prevent oligarchic capture, the privatization process relies entirely on a massive injection of outside capital. You have to open the doors to foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Ah, foreign investment.
Exactly. International capital is literally the only force large enough to actually buy out and dilute these entrenched domestic monopolies.
Oh, wow. So reintegrating into the global economy isn't just about chasing GDP growth. Attracting foreign investors is actually a structural requirement for neutralizing the old regime. It is literally an anti-corruption mechanism.
That is the crucial takeaway. Without foreign capital buying up those shares, the domestic monopolies remain intact and the democracy ultimately fails.
Which naturally brings us to what actually happens when Iran does reopen its doors to the world.
Yeah.
If a democratic, transparent Iran suddenly enters the global market, what does the data tell us about the economic prize?
Well, the macroeconomic projections from the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation are pretty staggering.
Yeah.
Globally, the nature of FDI has shifted. It used to be heavily focused on manufacturing and extraction, but now it's pivoting toward services, logistics, banking, technology, and green energy sectors.
And Iran has the workforce for that.
Exactly. They have a highly educated workforce perfectly positioned for this shift. If international sanctions are lifted and Iran implements the necessary domestic reforms like, modernizing their import tariffs and reviving their massive domestic auto industry,
Right.
World Bank modeling projects that Iran's per capita welfare could surge by up to 6.5%.
6.5%. That is a massive transformational jump for an economy of that size.
It is huge. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, this level of reintegration doesn't happen in a vacuum. A booming Iranian economy triggers a massive regional shockwave.
Oh, absolutely.
The entire economic geography of the Middle East would shift.
Let's map that out for a second. Who are the winners and losers in the neighborhood if Iran suddenly becomes an economic powerhouse?
Well, Turkey would be one of the biggest immediate beneficiaries.
Really? Turkey?
Yeah, because of their geographic proximity and their highly developed road and rail networks, Turkish firms would see an absolute boom in cross-border trade.
That makes sense.
Plus, Turkey's tourism sector would likely experience a massive surge from an influx of outbound Iranian travel. But on the flip side, major oil exporting nations like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait would take a significant hit.
Because of the oil supply.
Right. The economic models project that if Iranian crude oil fully and legally returns to the global market, it could trigger a 13% drop in global oil prices.
Wow. It's like dropping a massive boulder into a crowded pond. The splash beautifully waters the Turkish gardens on the shore, but it completely floods the Saudi and Kuwaiti oil rigs.
That's a vivid way to picture it. And it's not just oil. Take Qatar, for example. Qatar and Iran share the South Pars gas field.
Oh, right, the largest natural gas field in the world.
Exactly. For years, Qatar has completely dominated extraction because Iran lacked the foreign technology and investment to fully exploit their side of the field.
Because of the sanctions?
Right. But if Western energy companies bring modern extraction tech into a democratic Iran, Qatar suddenly faces fierce direct competition for a resource they essentially had free reign over.
So if you zoom out, a normalized Iran fundamentally changes the central question of Middle Eastern geopolitics. For decades, the entire dynamic has been about security and containment. How do we isolate Tehran militarily and ideologically?
Exactly.
But if this transition happens, the question for every neighboring country becomes, how on earth do we compete with them economically?
It completely shifts the battlefield from proxy wars to open markets. But, and this is a big, but there is a massive historical trap waiting for any transitioning nation that suddenly experiences a massive influx of wealth.
Right, because if a new democratic government suddenly has billions of dollars pouring in from foreign investment, plus that 6.5% surge in welfare, there is a tremendous temptation to just use that money to buy loyalty.
Yes.
If the new politicians just hand out oil money to stay in power, haven't we just reset the clock back to the era of the Shah?
You've hit on what economists call the resource curse, and the blueprints we're looking at are deeply concerned with it.
I bet.
They explicitly warn against a new democracy falling into the trap of centralized, oil-funded managerialism.
Managerialism.
Yeah, this was the fatal structural flaw shared by both the pre-1979 Shah era and the current Islamic Republic. The mechanism of the resource curse is simple but devastating.
How does it work?
Basically, when a state gets the vast majority of its budget from selling oil to foreign countries, it doesn't actually need to tax its own citizens.
Right.
And when a government doesn't rely on its citizens for tax revenue, it has absolutely no institutional incentive to listen to them or be accountable to them.
Oh, wow. It's the exact inverse of the American Revolution's rallying cry. No taxation without representation works both ways.
It really does.
If the government doesn't need your taxes, they do not care about your representation. So how do these global blueprints physically prevent the new government from falling into that trap?
Well, this raises an important question about institutional design. And they point to the global gold standard for managing resource wealth, Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund.
Norway, okay.
To insulate the new democracy from volatile oil prices and bureaucratic rent-seeking, the transition blueprints mandate that a new Iran must create a highly transparent, internationally invested savings fund. You basically take the oil revenue completely out of the hands of day-to-day politicians.
So what does this all mean? It sounds like true democratic consolidation isn't just about writing a new constitution or holding elections.
No, it's not.
It's about physically locking the national treasury so the new government can't just buy its way out of accountability. By legally hiding the oil money in a heavily restricted fund, you intentionally create a budget shortfall for the government.
Exactly. And how does a democratic government fill a budget shortfall?
By collecting income tax.
Yes. By building a diversified, productive economy and collecting income tax. The moment citizens start paying significant income tax, they start fiercely demanding to know exactly where their money is going.
which structurally forces the government to remain transparent.
Exactly. But there is still the immediate pain of the transition to deal with.
Right, the shock therapy phase.
Yeah. If you are using shock therapy, cutting subsidies, forcing the bonyads to compete, and hoarding the oil wealth in a savings fund, prices for basic goods are going to jump initially.
They're going to skyrocket.
Right. So how do you stop the population from starving during those first few chaotic years?
Yeah, how do you...
This is where the Argentina model comes in. The blueprints stress that macroeconomic austerity must be paired with microeconomic lifeboats.
Lifeboats, I like that term.
You have to implement direct, highly targeted cash transfers to the most vulnerable citizens. You cut the blanket subsidies that artificially lower the price of gas for everyone, including the rich, and instead you put cash directly into the pockets of the poor so they can afford food while the market stabilizes.
Wow.
If you don't protect the vulnerable during the shock therapy phase, the democracy will lose its public mandate and collapse before the reforms can take root.
This is such a brilliant, intricate puzzle. Let's pull all of these threads together because this entirely reframes how we should be thinking about Iran's future.
It really does.
The core takeaway for you listening is this. In Iran, economic recovery and democratic consolidation are not two separate goals. They're the exact same mechanism. You cannot fix the economy without dismantling the military boneyard complex through radical transparency and foreign capital. And you cannot secure a lasting democracy without fundamentally changing how the nation's natural wealth is managed, literally locking away the oil money to force the government to answer to its people.
I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to explore long after we sign off today.
Okay, let's hear it.
We've spent our time today analyzing the internal mechanics of this dual transition, right? But zoom out and imagine the external impact if Iran actually manages to pull this off.
The regional shockwave.
Yes. Imagine this nation transforming from an isolated, heavily sanctioned state into a secular, democratic economic powerhouse perfectly positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia.
It would be massive.
How would that fundamentally rewrite the entire global geopolitical map? If a booming democratic Iran emerges, does it neutralize the historical East-West divide in the Middle East overnight?
That is a staggering possibility to think about. A complete rewiring of global geopolitics, all starting with the methodical untangling of a subcontractor state. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll catch you next time.